Today we're talking about the flying autocannon boys. Let's go over the latest rules for Primaris suppressors and whether they have a point in a competitive Space Marine list. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today we're doing a unit review on the Primaris suppressors with a look over their datasheet, any obvious buffs and synergy for them, how I think about running them in game, and how they compare to other options. I've always found the suppressors to be a bit of a funny release for the Space Marines. Aside from Hellblasters, they were one of the few Primaris options with really heavy guns, and I think there was a lot of demand from the community, either for Primaris Assault Marines or Primaris Devastators, and Games Workshop sort of jumped the shark a bit and decided why don't we make Primaris Assault Marine Devastators. It's also just a little bit peculiar how they've never been released outside their Space Marine Vanguard Start Collecting box. I was expecting a multi-part kit for them somewhere down the line, something like the Infiltrators and Eliminators got, but it seems that hasn't been the case. It means that they're not really the easiest to acquire models, though to be honest the Space Marine Vanguard kit really isn't a bad one, and if you like the Phobos armor aesthetic, it's quite a good box for getting into the faction. In any case, let's talk about how they do in-game. Here we have the latest datasheet for Primaris suppressors. They are a fast attack choice for Codex Space Marines, and they cost you 100 points for a unit of 3. Much like the Eliminators, you can't field them in any bigger squads. 3 is all you get, which does hamper them a little bit when it comes to big sort of unit synergies. They essentially have the profile of a standard Primaris Intercessor with a 12-inch movement and fly, so for 33 points they really are quite fragile point for point compared with most of the other Primaris options. They've really got 3 reasons that you want to take them: their better movement, decent firepower with their accelerator autocannon, and their signature suppressing fire special rule which allows them to stop enemy overwatch. That accelerator autocannon has been tweaked a bit in the new decks. It used to be AP-2, now it's just a regular autocannon that fires 3 shots. In general, this has been a slight buff against virtually all targets. The range on it is really good. It does mean that you can keep these guys right back in your deployment zone and still have them plinking away at the enemy. Fewer people are taking 48-inch weaponry in 40k these days, often going for things like multi-melters or more close-ranged weapons. Ideally, in a lot of matchups, these guys should be able to sit at the back, pumping out fire all game long. Autocannons can help cover a niche within the Space Marine army. They're pretty good at anything that's toughness 5 or 6 with multi-wounds, and particularly handy against anything that's relying on good invul saves like Chaos Demons, who of course won't really care if you're shooting at them with a plasma gun or an autocannon, as they're saving on an invul save anyway. They're kind of passably good against Space Marines, Hordes and toughness 7 vehicles, and really quite bad against toughness 8. On average, your squad of 3 suppressors should average around about 4 dead orcs, 2 dead standard Space Marines, 4 wounds on anything toughness 5 or toughness 6, such as Gravis armor or light vehicles, or 3 wounds on a toughness 7 vehicle on average. I wouldn't say that any of those numbers are bad per se, but they're not a unit that's going to make back their points in a single round of shooting. You really need to be getting multiple rounds of fire out of these guys. In terms of special rules, they have this suppressing fire ability, which is the one that allows them to suppress overwatch. Each time the suppressor unit makes an attack against an enemy infantry unit, if a hit is scored, then the enemy unit can't fire overwatch this turn. You're pretty likely to hit with any given accelerator autocannon at least once, so basically provided you ping one autocannon into the unit, then they shouldn't be able to overwatch this turn. It is a bit sad that this is only limited to infantry, as a lot of the time some of the scariest things on Overwatch are really big vehicles like say an Imperial Knight, but it certainly can have its uses, say if you were about to charge into a whole thicket of Tau Fire Warriors, or maybe if you were wanting to charge down a big squad of Space Marine aggressors, who could potentially hit you with something like 35 flamer hits for the squad that was trying to make the charge. I don't see this ability being massively useful in every game that you play, but every so often it really could come in handy, and allow one of your more fragile units to charge something that would have fried them in Overwatch otherwise. In addition to this, they have Angels of Death, which is good for a bit more AP on those autocannons, Death from Above, which can allow them to deep strike, but generally I don't think it's worth it, as we'll talk about in the in-game use section. And in terms of keywords, they have quite a lot of good ones. They're Primaris Core Infantry with a fly keyword, and interestingly enough they have the smokescreen keyword as well, which allows them to be -1 to hit if it makes a difference for 1 CP. One of the main issues that I see with the suppressors is that their mobility and firepower is kind of at odds. On the one hand, you really want to use their great mobility every turn, jumping them around 12 inches and getting optimal position while keeping safe from enemy threats. On the other hand, if you don't stand still, you're going to be taking the heavy weapon penalty every turn, and reduce their slightly mediocre damage outputs to even worse than it would be normally. For most armies, they're a unit that you're going to have to choose between one or the other each turn. You're not going to be able to have maximal damage output and also have the movement. In general, I think they're a reliable unit that will usually make an impact on the game, though I think it's quite rare that they'd be able to make a big impact on the game and really achieve anything massively notable. They're more likely to just chip off a few wounds here and there and have reliable damage output each turn. So what can we do to make suppressors even stronger? As we mentioned, they really quite like having combat doctrines active, as those autocannons will really thank you for being in Devastator doctrine and going up to AP -2. It makes them so much more efficient against Space Marines and vehicles with a 3+ armor save. I think that some chapters will have more of a use for them than others. In particular, Iron Hands and Ultramarines both have unique doctrines that allow them to jump around while still firing at full accuracy, and the Iron Hands is the Devastator doctrine and gives you reroll 1s to hit with heavy weapons as well. Would have certainly allowed them some optimal positioning and damage dealing turn 1, and make them a bit better as an Alpha Strike unit. Ultramarines would have to wait for their tactical doctrine in turn 2 and 3, but again is very useful for a unit that both wants to be moving fast and firing accurately. Imperial Fist also has a decent Devastator doctrine for these guys, making them really quite solid at Alpha Striking light vehicles. If they fire against a vehicle, then their damage will go up to 3, and they'll also get to ignore cover to boot. So in theory, if you do get to fire against an ideal target like a Toughness 6 vehicle, you'd be averaging a very respectable 8 wounds on the thing turn 1. Otherwise, Dark Angels can get a bit more accuracy with their Grim Resolve. If they do decide to stay still and just act as gun platforms, then they'll be hitting on 2s. And of course, any of the more assault-based chapters, things like Blood Angels and Space Wolves, might be able to make use of them as a support piece and stop the enemy firing Overwatch if they might be tempted to. In general, aside from innate buffs, I think that suppressors are generally going to be a unit that you want to use without too much support. Being fast moving and a relatively small unit usually means it's not quite as much worth bothering with being in character auras or using any single unit buffs such as litanies or psychic powers. Of course, if it does just happen to be convenient for them, getting in reroll auras of captains or lieutenants is no bad thing, and if they do happen to be within your firebase, apothecaries could heal them, and if they're inside the aura for a chapter ancient, they might get some shooting on death. As core Primaris infantry, they do have quite a lot of access to different stratagems, though again, I think the vast majority just aren't really worth bothering with. Sure, you could spend 2 CP to put them in the Devastator doctrine, or similar to have them counter stationary on a turn that they moved, but it's just not going to be worth it for the amount invested. As with most Primaris Marines, I think that transhuman physiology is one of the most efficient stratagems, particularly if these guys get shot with something strength 8 or above, and you could always consider smokescreen, particularly effective if you are getting shot by ballistic skill 4 weapons. So how would I use suppressors in game then? Firstly, as I mentioned earlier, I'd almost never deep strike them. Generally these guys want to be firing for multiple turns, and with 48-inch range you should be able to guarantee some shooting at least on turn 1. If you can outrange the enemy, they're quite a good option for deploying high in ruins in your own deployment zone, somewhere with really good lines of sight. If they need to take cover, they can always jump down with fly. If you think that there's a good chance they might just get alpha struck off the board, you can always just hide them out of line of sight somewhere in your own deployment zone, and use that very good movement to take up firing positions turn 1. Sure, you will miss out on a bit of damage output, but it's better than losing some fairly fragile and fairly expensive Primaris Marines straight on turn 1. From there, each turn you'll have to weigh up carefully whether you want to stay still for maximum damage output, or use that 12-inch movement to move up the board, get better lines of fire, or stay safe from the enemy. If you are jumping them about, then they could be quite good for reaching table quarters or jumping onto far-flung objectives. It is quite nice to have a unit that can do this while also dishing out a reasonable amount of damage. Ideally, you just want to have more pressing threats that are going to be shot before the suppressors, and outrange as much of the enemy army as possible while doing so. I particularly consider using them on a bit more of a mobility front if you don't have all that many good targets for them in the enemy army. If the enemy is coming at you with a bunch of toughness 6 vehicles though, then maybe just standing them still and unleashing their firepower could be the best thing. It's quite interesting that if your opponent does have some -1 hit modifiers all over the place, you could easily jump these guys around 12 inches, they'll still have the -1 to hit, but they don't stack any further anymore, so you're not going to be any worse off. It means that if you're planning to take aim at enemy flyers, generally you can always use that 12-inch movement to stay safe while doing so. Of course, I certainly wouldn't forget about the Overwatch denial, but I think it's going to be fairly niche in application, and only useful if your opponent was really going to spend that command point to fire Overwatch anyway. Great on anything with massive Overwatch potential, such as Tau Fire Warriors or Aggressor Squads, but might be largely irrelevant if your opponent doesn't have any good Overwatch units. So the question remains, do they have a real place in a competitive Space Marine army? For me, I would say that if you want some dedicated anti-tank fire, I would consider alternatives. Eradicators are going to win any sort of anti-tank battle, even against light vehicles, and attack bikes can significantly beat them out in the anti-tank contest, while also being equally fast and having pretty good durability to boot. I'd also weigh them up against units that are dedicated either for moving about all the time or being gunline units, rather than slightly weirdly trying to do both like the Suppressor Squad. For me, I think they do struggle to shine a bit compared with other options, and if I was building a competitive list, I think I would only take one squad at maximum. I think played well, they're not likely to harm your list all that much, and in certain matchups with ideal targets, things like Chaos Demons or Drakari, they could really come into their own, and could potentially make the game go in a completely different way if you did come up against a unit that you really needed to charge but had incredibly scary Overwatch. So let me know what you think of the Suppressor squad down in the comments below. I'll be particularly interested to hear your thoughts if you have been using them through 9th edition. If you've enjoyed this video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we'll certainly be keeping the Space Marine unit reviews coming over the coming weeks. If you have been enjoying the videos on the channel and would like to help support, I would just like to mention that I have a Patreon link which is down in the video description below, and it's how I can afford to spend quite this much time making videos about model soldiers. If you are enjoying regularly and would like to help support the channel patrons do get a fair few advantages. You get to see certain new videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next for the channel, and automatic entry into the Auspex Tactics prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.